I'm pleased to be with 4 outstanding transit CEOs today. Carm Basile, Capital District Transportation Authority in Albany, New York. India Birdsong, Greater Cleveland Regional Transit Authority in Ohio. Andre Colaiace, Access Services, Los Angeles County, California. And Karen King, Golden Empire Transit District in Bakersfield, California. Good afternoon, panelists. Actually, I should say good morning to Andre and Karen, since you're coming from California. Our topic today is preparing senior managers who are what we call CEO aspirants to build solid, lasting relationships with the board when they take the helm of a transit authority. Extremely important topic, as our panelists well know, and I think all CEOs and CEO aspirants around the country would agree. Let's begin by your sharing with our viewers what you see as the key characteristics of a really close, positive, and productive board CEO partnership. Karen, why don't you lead off?
I would be happy to, Doug. I like alliteration. So in thinking about this question, I came up with actually 5 Ps that I think are characteristics that are critically important. The first one is professional. You have to demonstrate that you're competent, skillful, assured. The second is personable, not personal, but personable, that you can talk to anyone, that you're well-spoken, that you look people in the eye, shake their hand firmly. Productive, that you're results-oriented, and that you're pleasant about doing that, not driven, but results-oriented, that you're a partner. Board members are your partner, and it's important to be a good partner. Board members are not mind readers, so you have to be able to help them be a good partner. And then lastly, process. Process is so important when you're working with board members. You have to work the process to get the results that you want.
Now, everyone, thank you, Karen. Now, everyone, join in and let's focus also on the nature of the partnership. How do you know it's really solid and productive and that it will endure? What are some signs of that, panelists?
Well, Doug, you know, this is, as Karen said, this is driven by words that begin with P, right? Personal, partnership, professional, personable. I like that. As humans, I think we understand when someone is reacting positively or not positively, but you also shouldn't expect it to happen overnight, right? If you're building a partnership, right? Rome was not built in a day. It takes time. It takes patience. It takes sort of understanding. And I would suggest that, you know, a regular schedule be set up so that this is something that is important to you. It's important to your board chair, your board members that you're dealing with, meeting with, and trying to establish and build that partnership. So make it regular, make it frequent, keep it relaxed, personable, and professional, but check in often. Don't let too much time go by without checking in. If you do that, there's the first sign of trouble.
What does a really close partnership look like, panelists? Anyone like to weigh in on that? If you were observing it, how would you know?
I think, Doug, that, and I think that's excellent advice from both Karen and Carm about how to build, I think, that bond, that trust with your board chair, with your board members. It's just absolutely essential to have that bond. And I think what it looks like is that you can be frank with one another. So there's always going to be tough issues when you're running an agency. And you have to be able to go to your board members, to your board chair, and be frank with them about some of the issues you might be having, and maybe about some of the difficult decisions that you might have to make to rectify the situation. So if you have that solid foundation of trust, and I think as Karen and Carm gave some excellent advice about how to build that foundation, then you can start getting into a relationship where you can really have productive conversations about solving complex issues.
I'll hop in as well and piggyback off of Andre. I think that's absolutely right. Being able to have transparency is really important. And I'd say it looks like progress, right? So being able to change the culture if that's what's needed, being able to really have those critical conversation when needed, and then being able to be honest about what your vision is, I'd say, for the agency is going to be an important thing as well. I find that sometimes, especially if you have boards that are large, you have differing visions that are going on, right? So we all have boards where, we may be blessed in the beginning because all board members perhaps, voted us in as CEO or president or whatever the title is unanimously, right? So your idea is that everybody has the same vision, but over time that board may change and that board may adjust, and you've got to be able to dance, so to speak, with those personalities and understand what the preferences are, and how to weave that into the road that you've already paved. So I would say definitely I'm in agreement for transparency and progress is really what it looks like to have a successful board relationship.
Would anyone like to add anything before we move on? This is a great beginning. We're on a roll. So let's move on to the second question, a closely related question. What concrete steps would you advise CEO aspirants to take early in their CEO tenure to build a truly solid partnership with the board? What should they do concretely and specifically to build that partnership right after they take the helm, if not before? And why don't you lead off on this, India?
Sure, I'd be happy to. It's funny that question seems to be on the agenda today. We actually here in RTA in Cleveland just finished up our board retreat last week. And so that was really our first board retreat coming out of the pandemic, knocking on all surfaces wood, hoping that we're really out of it or emerging from it. And really getting out of a virtual environment aside from just board meetings and getting through resolutions and doing the normal business of the day. We really thought it was important to bring the board together physically offsite for an entire day. And what we talked about was not so much the governance, but more the deep dive into communication styles. And that was something that hadn't been done with the group of folks we have, because as I mentioned before, we're in a situation here in Cleveland where more than half of our board has been on the trusteeship for less than 3 years. So we have a lot of turnover that we're going through. And then on the other side, we've got folks that have been around for over a decade. So understanding what the expectations are of communication, I think are really important. I have been here under 3 years, and I'd say, 75% of that has been through the pandemic. So for all intents and purposes, we're kind of starting afresh. And understanding how I operate may not be how everyone else operates on the board. So even if the sense of urgency is different, if I adjust and I start at 7 a.m. and they start at 2 p.m. or that kind of thing, there's an expectation. I think that conversation has to be had early about how do you like to receive communications? Are you a texter? Right? Or in a virtual environment, are you an emailer? Do you like the phone call, or do you like to meet for coffee? Those kind of things I think are really important because, like I said, everyone's different. I can't express how important, I think it was Carm who mentioned, a regular schedule check-in. Absolutely, I think is imperative to make sure people understand that they're important and they're on your radar, even if there's not an emergency. Because I think the idea of having a relationship well built before the emergency happens is where it comes in handy. What you don't want to do is build that relationship when you're in a forced environment where, you know, things are on fire, so to speak. That's not always the best term in public transit, but that's the one we all recognize is what we don't want to happen. And then I also think understanding that board members' strengths and weaknesses. So why did they join the board? They might have been appointed, but usually you've got a little bit of discussion and politics that go into board appointments. So understanding their impression of your agency from where they come, I think is going to be really important to understand maybe what their crusade is as a board member. I find that most board members have a penchant for something. I may have a board member that's really into the data and the analytics, and maybe they're a CPA and, you know, accounting is their thing. So they're really into the audits, or they're really into the capital budget. Or another person may be really into DE&I and community outreach. So they're thinking about how do we train and hire and all of that. So understanding what their niche is and being able to connect the dots early on, I think makes board members feel more comfortable and really utilized. And it makes me as a CEO understand how to pitch projects and gather input so they serve more as an advisor instead of a day-to-day operations. That's what I'm here for.
So you're saying job one, or at least one of the first concrete steps, get to know your board members as well as you can in a number of ways. So another great first response, and so I'm throwing it open to the panel. What other steps would you take, Karen?
I just have a quick little example of how not to do it. I think that India hit it on the head with communication, and that communication with your board members is so important. Early on in my first position as a CEO, I had a board member call and leave me a voice message, and she said, "Oh, and you don't need to call me back." So I didn't. I then got a very strong tongue lashing for not having called her back to thank her for her voicemail. And that told me, you know, it's really important to acknowledge each of your board members as an individual. And they don't always say what they mean. You have to be able to read between the lines. And no matter how good a communicator you are, you can always get better.
Good.
Well, you know, Karen, you bring up a good point, and this session is addressed towards aspirants, right? We're supposed to give them tips and hints and how to, you know, proceed in this very interesting world of CEO board member relationships. You would think you wouldn't have to say what you just said. You would think that you wouldn't have to say, for example, the board member is different than a salesperson, right? You get a call from a salesperson, maybe you return it, maybe you don't, maybe you download it to a staff person. Board members rise to a different level, right? They're my 10 best friends. That's how I treat them. They're my 10 best friends, even if some days they don't feel like the best of friends, right? We need to teach aspirants that they go to a different level and they should be treated differently. I mean, you don't have to cowtail and you don't have to be insincere or not sincere, but like you say, a simple phone call, a simple email, an acknowledgement of an event that you know that's important to that board member. And there are all kinds of ways to do that and to keep track of things like that. But aspirants really need to understand that those board members really make or break us. India said earlier, you know, they may have voted unanimously to hire us, but boy, a year later, something changes. You know, why is that? Well, you can usually go back and track it right to an event, right to an issue. So the reminder is please treat your board members a little differently than you do a salesperson.
And I think, Doug, you talk about this a lot, where you've known a lot of CEOs who the operations were running great, yet they got in trouble with their board. And why is that? It's because And this goes back to Karen's, one of her P's being personable. And I would say manners also. It's like, you're there to serve the public. You're also there to serve your board, and not, as Carm said, in a servile fashion, but you're there to be responsive to them. And I think that was a great anecdote about whether they say they want to call back or not, you still should be calling them. And if you are not responsive to them, again, you could have the best transit operation in the United States. You could win APTO awards and all these other things. But if they don't feel you're responsive to them as a person, they're not going to like you. And that's going to cause problems down the road when things aren't going so well. And even when they are going well. So I think that discussion is really, really valuable for people who are aspiring to be a CEO. So.
And you don't learn that necessarily climbing the ladder to the top spot. And that's why we're having this this panel session.
I would say you learn the opposite through American culture, where we hold up certain CEOs who are more like generals as opposed to collaborators. And I think that's the wrong model, particularly in the public sector. I would say it's the wrong model in general. And I think if you go into a public sector job or a transit job with a board and you start acting like a 5-star general, again, you're going to get into trouble somewhere down the line, because again, the public sector is more collaborative, I think, than the private sector. And I think you need to realize that. I probably said on more than one occasion, I must have written about it, that for every CEO I've seen run into trouble over my 35 some years of working with boards, run into trouble for performance reasons. I mean, objective, things aren't running on time, safety's not being dealt with, and so on and so forth. For every one example, I could come up with 15 where the relationship between the board and the CEO has eroded because of personality clashes, not even rising to philosophical. I mean, literally questions related to style of interaction, style of communication. And that's something I think CEO aspirants have to understand, at least to survive over the long term. What else would you like to add?
If I could add just a bit, I think it was said just a little bit, we touched on it, that you don't learn that, right? That kind of aptitude to be able to really work on the relationships. Sometimes the best laid plans can be totally eroded by that lack of communication. And then I would say too, we get into an operational space. So the idea of the 5-star general, I really like that, because I think that sometimes the operations speak louder, right, than that small nuance of communication. So if you've got a major emergency going on, a 4-alarm fire, everybody's hands on deck. But what happens to those small wins, the small celebrations where you have a really good day and you want to be able to put out a press release about something, a major project or a small project that's going on. And maybe it was something that was really important to a board member and they helped you be able to craft that. Get the quote for the press release and put it out there from the board member, or make the quick nod to them in the presentation that you have to your staff. Make sure that you include them in the work. I find that goes a long way when it comes to creating a team environment for the board, because sometimes if their only interaction with your staff and with the team that's kind of doing the work is only at board meetings, it creates this sort of us and them environment that you don't want to have. And then also, you want to make sure that a board member will tell you up front when something is going right or wrong so that you can address it. So making sure that they feel like they're part of the team and celebrating the wins, that's something that I think I've begun to learn in this role, that you've got to do a little bit of extra work to make sure that they feel like they're part of the team. And especially if you're relying on them to sort of pave the way or provide guidance, that's important. That's equally important to getting the run out and making sure that we have great customer service and all those tactical things that we do from day to day. We can't take for granted the strategy that comes with being a board member and making sure that they get kudos for that the same way that your operational staff would.
And you know, kudos, a kind of providing a kind of ego satisfaction, is what I call non-monetary compensation for people who are working very hard but not being paid. And you all know board meetings can be grueling, and the work of governing can be very taxing. So what I hear you saying is think about how you can compensate your board members. You can't pay them, but one thing you can do is provide them ego satisfaction, recognition. And I see this, by the way, within an increasing number of CEOs who are now drafting board chair reports at the board meeting, instead of the only well-prepared report being the report of the CEO. Really board savvy CEOs, many at least, I think a growing number, recognize, whoa, we could draft a really good report for the board chair, who's very likely to find that quite ego satisfying. So, any other comments on this second question? Steps you need to take concretely to build your partnership with the board. Anything else before we go on?
One more, if I can do that. I did have a little note on understanding their strength and weakness. I say, if I can just mention that, because we're so dependent on virtual right now. We might have a board member whose niche is not technology. And if it's the penchant of the agency to move to paperless, you might have to be able to consult that board member along the way, just as an example, and make sure that they can get the connectivity and that they're comfortable with the devices and you're not moving ahead of where their comfort level is. So I just want to mention that too, because I do think that understanding the ebb and flow of the technology sort of dependence is really important, at least in my experience, for the different levels of education when it comes to that, and making sure you do everything you can to make them as comfortable.
And you know, this question of strengths and weaknesses reminds me of what I heard from a transit CEO actually within the past week, who talked about, and I forget how the subject came up, but was talking about how he had a very effective board chair at working one-on-one with key stakeholders in the community, but could not be relied on at all to stand at the podium and make an inspiring presentation. It wasn't his passion, the board chair's passion, definitely wasn't a skill at the podium or the lectern, but he couldn't be beat one-on-one. So what the CEO said to me was, and I made sure we didn't book him to speak in public forums, but we used him to the max whenever we needed good one-on-one interaction with the county commissioner or the mayor or the deputy mayor of the city and so on. Anything else come to mind? Okay, let's move on then to question 3. And by the way, I want my colleagues on the panel not to be reticent at all about chiming in when an idea comes to you, whether it fits the question or not, including if something comes to your mind from the first 2 questions. Take us back to those questions freely, because the CEO aspirants who are watching this will benefit tremendously. So, question 3, dear colleagues, what barriers and challenges should CEO aspirants expect to face, to have to surmount in carrying out these partnership building steps you've been talking about? What potholes should they expect in the partnership building road as they travel it? And why don't you take this, Carm? At least be our first responder.
Lots of them. This job is a series of adjustments. You're constantly making adjustments, and I think India hit the nail on the head. You know, strengths and weaknesses. You really have to take stock of your board members and understand, you know, what they're good at, what they're not good at, what they like, what they don't like, and adjust accordingly. I mean, one size does not, will not fit all. And if you put board members into that category of board members, and I'm going to treat everyone the same, it won't take long. It will not take long for you to get into trouble. And I think based on conversation, based on meetings, based on input from board members, which, by the way, I don't see us as an industry being open to board members having commentary. I mean, it's their show, not our show. I think sometimes CEOs get a little caught up in who's running the organization, right? Without them, they really don't need me. So I think lots of obstacles, nothing in particular, but I guess I would warn aspirants, don't think of all board members, don't categorize a board member the same. All 10 people are in my case, 10 individuals. They're all different. They come from all walks of life. I have 2 retirees. I have an attorney. I have an engineer. I mean, those are all different portfolios that get brought to the board table. And for me to treat everyone the same, even if it was totally professional and totally personal and totally appropriate, it likely won't work. It's really that personal touch that Karen talked about, I think, on the first question. And if you don't do that, and you don't really understand what makes that board member tick, you're going to run into trouble.
Panelist.
I'd jump in with a couple of very practical and obvious things, but they're things we sometimes forget, or if you're new in the job, you just don't think about. And one of them is that board members are just like us. They're very busy and they're very caught up in their own issues and businesses. And, you know, we're working in ours every day and are immersed in it. And they don't have the same level of knowledge and commitment and that the CEO and the staff have. So don't be afraid to repeat things. I always think that the minute my board member leaves the board meeting, they don't think about me again until the next board meeting, and everything we talked about gets erased. So if we're picking it up again, we've got to do a couple of backtracks to get them back up to speed. And then the second one should go without saying, but I'm going to say it anyway, and that is board members really dislike surprises. Whether it's a good surprise, a bad surprise, just information that they don't know, they don't like to be caught by surprise. So it goes back to that communication that India was talking about. You can't have too much communication. And if there is an issue, be it a celebration or be it a four-alarm fire, don't catch them by surprise. Don't let them hear it on the 6 o'clock news at night before you've informed them. No surprises ever if you can help it.
Great. Words of wisdom. Panelist?
Yeah, I would just like to add, and I think this goes back to some of the prior discussion about, you come into the job with a public unanimous vote for your candidacy to become executive director or CEO, but behind the scenes, your board might not be so united. And I think this goes back to everything we've been talking about. So as a new CEO or as an aspirant CEO, you need to go then meet with your board members to find out what makes them tick. Because in public, perhaps for your appointment, they were all united, but boards are rarely united. And so sometimes the biggest obstacle is that your board is actually split on some things, whether it could be political philosophy, there could be Democrats and Republicans on the board, there could be different philosophies about how to run the agency. I remember at my first agency job that there was a major split on the board between whether to stay with diesel or go with compressed natural gas buses. And you wouldn't think that that would be a big debate on the board, but it was massive, and it split the board down the middle and really led to a lot of tension. So as a CEO, if you're not aware of these things, if you say, oh, well, I just got a unanimous vote to come take over this agency, but then you don't do the groundwork, the legwork of meeting with them and communicating with them, you wouldn't know about that until perhaps it was too late. So you have to know, like, what's going on, what are the splits on the board, what are their philosophies, what makes each board member tick, and how can I kind of coach everybody to make them all get on the same page? Because ultimately, if your board is not on the same page, they don't have the same vision, again, you're going to be into trouble. So again, I think one of the biggest things is, public unity, but really there's perhaps private discord. And I think that's really a trap that you need to be aware of.
How do you get to that? Just personal one-on-one interaction, Andre?
I think so, because that's where you can have those conversations about, hey, where do you see the agency in 5 years? How do you think things have been run? What would you like to see different? What would you like to keep the same? And then you can find out, oh, well, I really don't like this move towards electric vehicles, or I don't like this move towards CNG or whatever. Back 20 years ago, that was the debate. So you can find that out. And then then the tough part begins, where you have to try and figure out how to thread the needle between those competing factions on your board. How do you bring them together for a common purpose? And that's the difficult part. But if you don't figure out what the issue is first, you're never going to get to that second part. So,
and what you're all saying suggests that governance needs to be a top tier priority in terms of time. And I would venture to say, and I don't know if the four of you would agree, but I would suggest to a CEO aspirant that they be prepared when they take the helm to spend somewhere in the 25 to 30% of their prime time paying attention to governance, to the workings of the board, to the people on the board, and so on. Would you all agree with that? Spending?
I definitely would agree with that. I would say that I think someone made a distinction between public and private. It might have been Andre in the beginning. And public is what I can speak to. And I'd say there's a lot of effort that goes into managing board relationships and managing that. I think more so than at least I've had in any other type of job. And I even have had, conversations with other executives in different industries and different agency types. And they said, wow, you seem to have a lot of time spent with your board. And I said, yeah, that's part of the job. And I think that, 25% that you mentioned, Doug, makes a lot of sense, because they are your navigation, right? They're kind of the way that you navigate through city politics or town politics. Being able to kind of get that understanding, if you really, really utilize them in their capacities. I think Carm mentioned he's got an engineer, he's got a lawyer, he's got, different members, they have different skill sets. So if you want to tap into that, it's almost like saying you've got, 10 or 5 new members of your executive team. And the same amount of energy you put into those individuals to make sure they have the right success outcomes, you got to do that same thing with your board, not to bother them, right? And you don't want to become too much of a communicator so that they're, not picking up your phone call, but you want to make sure that you're pouring into them. So yeah, I think it's a facet of the job, and any CEO who doesn't realize that might find themselves with issues later on down the line.
I hear you all saying, don't take the board for granted. It's dangerous. And I'm intrigued by the idea of the CEO wearing different hats. And one of the hats I've seen I've seen worn more frequently in recent years is what I call the theatrical producer hat, where the CEO really does try to make board meetings more enjoyable, more interesting, more entertaining. And the old-time CEO, of course, just assumes it's enough you give them good information. A hefty packet with the right information for them to thumb through. And it doesn't really matter if that's a somewhat excruciatingly boring process of reading through a major packet. That's enough. That's your job. Respond. Read them, respond. And I'm seeing now a growing recognition. No, that's not enough. You've got to think about how you produce a board meeting.
I think that's the data dump death spiral, Doug, if I can say that, right? I think sometimes you give too much and it almost to me looks like we might be hiding something. I think sometimes when you give somebody a dictionary worth of information, to someone's point, they've got 9 to 5s. Make it easy for them to understand and digest so that you can retain the responsibility of being the subject matter expert. That's not what they signed on to. They signed on to becoming, an advisor.
So you give the modern CEO who's interested in a really positive partnership and a lasting partnership will pay attention to things like using graphics in financial reports. No ugly rows and columns of numbers, page after page after page, when you've got the choice of PowerPoint and different graphical modes of presentation.
Well,
It's
and I'd like to give the Hollywood perspective, Doug, if I may.
Of course you would.
Los Angeles. Although I'm a Rhode Islander, a native Rhode Islander, but I've been here long enough and I've learned this, and we have an excellent marketing person and a video production person. And every board meeting, we have a Superior Service Award to start the board meeting, where we highlight one of our contractors' employees who's going above and beyond to help our customers. And that, people love it. And I know a lot of other agencies do it, but it gets to your point, like sometimes the soft stuff matters, whether it's the design of your presentations, these videos where the board can start the meeting feeling good about the agency. Like, hey, there's this person who I never would have met otherwise. You just show me a 2-minute video about how they helped the customer the other day. And that makes me feel good about things, and it makes me feel good about the agency. And I think that's very important. So I think we all are technical experts in our fields, but I think that's not always what the board wants necessarily. You need to kind of balance the hard facts with some of the feel-good stuff, videos about how you're helping the public, because that's ultimately what we're here for.
So a related theme then, your job as a CEO is, if you want a lasting relationship with the board, is to enrich the work of governing, to spice it up, to make it more interesting and stimulate it, which it won't automatically be. It can be drudgery. You all agree?
Yes.
It can easily be drudgery. And I think that applies certainly to a complex industry like public transit. Well, we got a great array of practical techniques on the table. Let's move on to our fourth question, and then we'll throw it open again for any further thoughts. So, question 4. If you were putting together the curriculum of what you might call an aspiring CEO's academy, specifically for senior managers and executives who aspire to take the helm of the transit authority, what major topics would you address in this curriculum? What would the curriculum look like? If we were putting a program together, what would you want to see on the curriculum? And I'm going to toss this to Andre for a first response.
Well, first I'd show this video, Doug. No, just
hey, I think that's
yeah, just
great idea. Thank you.
Just kidding. I think that
I'm not.
Okay.
I think it's a great idea.
I think you know, when in transit's a unique business, and most of the CEOs in transit come from transit, and whether it's operations or planning, mainly finance sometimes. And I think that a lot of the things we do on a day-to-day basis in transit don't necessarily prepare one for becoming a CEO. So I think the curriculum, the ideal curriculum, should look at some of those soft skills that we've been talking about, such as written and verbal communication. You know, work on that and on the importance of that in terms of both speaking publicly, speaking to your board members privately, making presentations, etc. I think that's very, very important. I think a subset of that would be media relations, because at some point you'll have to deal with the media, and I think it's important to understand some of the basic rules about doing that. I think Karen mentioned boards don't like surprises. They really don't like surprises about the media, and I think that's an important topic that should be covered. I think government affairs, public affairs principles, but when you become a CEO, unless you were the government affairs person like I was, I don't think you often have a lot of experience doing some of the important business, working with the government, your government partners, the Federal Transit Administration, your local congressional office, and working with them to get their support, which equals often financial support for your agency. So I would also say kind of a government affairs segment. And then finally, I think legal affairs. A lot of times when you're working below the CEO, you don't have to deal with some of the unfortunate lawsuits that come out of running a transit business. And I think just knowing some of those principles would be helpful. So I think kind of we all come up to the CEO position knowing a lot about transit, but oftentimes there's some other skills, some of these softer skills that we don't. And I think it would be helpful for aspiring CEOs or new CEOs to be taught about some of that stuff. So.
Panelists, weigh in.
If I could, I'd also add bringing in guests, you know, whether they're guest speakers or other industry professionals, or even project partners to your board meetings, to be able to kind of speak to the importance of a partnership that you've got going for the agency, or a community impact study, and maybe, you know, a resource group that feels the effect of the service that you're providing, so that your board can understand the importance of the service from a perspective that's not just yours and not just the agency's, because that way I think it gives them a more well-rounded respect for the work that your staff does, but then they also can hear it from the horse's mouth, good, bad, or indifferent. Public comment is a good example of that. But I know that we try to bring in our partners. So if we have a major project that's going on and we're partnering with a local entity, we try to say, hey, would you like to partner with us to be able to provide the presentation to the board? So that way they understand the community impact. And then also something that I don't think we do enough in the industry is sending our boards to industry conferences. That can be tremendously helpful in having board members talk to other board members who have been serving for longer or even that are new, so they understand sort of what the nuances are of our ask for them, and that also they kind of get a crash course in the semantics of the operations or other, you know, new phenomenons that are coming out, diesel versus hybrid versus CNG versus autonomous and electric and all these things, so that they can feel like they also are coming from a place of knowledge. And it might be able to fast track some of those relationships. And then also they have an opportunity to see the CEO maybe on a panel and be able to understand what relevance their particular board brings to the industry. It can be a good booster of morale for not only the board member, but also for the CEO.
More curriculum ideas, my friends.
I would suggest that aspirants and probably even new CEOs do internships. And what I mean by that is get yourself on a couple of boards. What better way to experience life from a board member perspective than to be one? And it surprises me the number of people in senior level positions in organizations like ours who don't do that. Not only is it good for you as an aspiring CEO to understand how boards operate, but it's good for your organization to get you out there and show the flag. But, you know, selfishly, yeah, I've been on countless boards. I probably sit on 6 right now. And I see, you know, good things and I see bad things. It just is an easy way to sort of bone up on board membership and what it means. And boy, it's interesting. You know how it feels when communication is not good. You know how it feels when your time is not valued. You know how it feels when you get that stack of information that is just like, what do you want me to do with this? Other than just toss it in the garbage. So do an internship or two, especially if you aspire to do what we do every day.
I would add a topic to the agenda for a course for those aspiring to be a CEO that is a little bit sensitive, and that is something no one warned me about, but it's very lonely at the top. You don't have any confidants within your organization typically, or among your board members that you can really share with. So I would recommend to those that are aspiring to be a CEO that they build a good network among other CEOs within the industry, so they can pick up the phone and call and say, I've got this board member that's driving me nuts, and maybe just get a pat on the back or some good advice. You know, nobody ever told me about career coaches or CEO counseling or any of those services that are available today. And I've spent a long career being lonely. And it can really take its toll on you. And I think that's something that people who are aspiring to the position don't understand, that it is lonely at the top.
Other thoughts? I would like to throw in, may I? Throw in a curriculum thought. You all know, because I know you're all extremely board savvy, that the field of governance is not a real field. It has not developed into a full-fledged field with universally accepted principles, best practices, tremendous amount of debate around the country on what it even means to govern. I mean, seriously, the definition of governing is debated. And I've done enough interviewing of board members over the years to know there's not agreement on what it means to govern. And so I think one part of a curriculum, and perhaps part of continuing education in governance, is to focus on what is it, this function, what makes up this function. It's what a board does. What is it concretely? And where is the field going? And how do you stay abreast of it? Since there's no one journal, there's no one source of information, tremendous debate about right and wrong practices. So one of the things we need to, I think, teach CEO aspirants is you're going to have to master this rapidly changing, somewhat amorphous collection of functions that make up governing. You're going to have to figure out what's happening, what's going on, and how you get information. Where do you turn for good information? Mentors? If so, what mentors? How do you find a mentor? And so on and so forth. Well, my friends, we've come to close to an hour, which is what has been scientifically proven to be the maximum amount of time people are likely to want to spend listening to experts and watching them. This has been very, very fascinating for me, and I want to, and I'm sure for our viewers who will find it very informative. I want to thank you, dear panelists. I know what your schedules are like for taking this much time to contribute to the preparation of CEO aspirants to take the helm as far as the governance dimension of the work. Are there any closing comments? Any closing bits of wisdom you'd like to share before we bid each other adieu?
Doug, I would just like to thank you for the work that you do in this area, because it is a bit of a mystery. And I've known you for 20 plus years. And
I know we were young. We were young.
Yes, we
back
were. And I have drawn on what I've learned from you many times. So I just want to give you kudos for continuing to try and disciple people in.
I think we lost you there a minute. Are you still with us, Karen?
Yes, I am.
Oh.
Did you? I was just thanking you for continuing to pursue discipling us all in this topic of governance and the practices that will help us be successful.
Well, I appreciate your kind comments. And I also assume, by the way, that you all, the four of you, do a certain amount of mentoring. I hope you do anyway, with your top lieutenants who are coming along, and share what you've learned with them directly. And you know, fellow, you can testify to this, India, that Steve Bland, for example, in Nashville, I think, played this role well, didn't he?
He did. I absolutely, that's, you're reading my mind, Doug, and Karen, I absolutely appreciate the emphasis that's put on this as a newer CEO. And you're right, Steve was a great sort of tutor in that. And it was nice to be able to be, to have exposure to the board. Nashville was, and I believe still is, unique, where it has two different boards, one that's got in excess of 34 or 32 people, and the other one has 5. So it was definitely a crash course in seeing the difference in management between a really, really large and a more intimate board. But I will say, as a new-ish, right, CEO, having exposure to the board as an executive, maybe just underneath that CEO level, is invaluable. I cannot imagine that I would be as successful, knock on wood, that I have been so far with our board without that sort of exposure, and being able to have that sort of interaction with board members and respecting the balance in the hierarchy and all of that, but still being able to be myself and follow the CEO's lead. So definitely think that that's important, and I hope to be able to replicate that here in Cleveland.
And you know, I was thinking about a bit of advice I would give to and have given to CEO aspirants that we haven't talked a lot about today. I think it's been in the background. Maybe we've talked about it a bit sideways. But I would say, and I hope you agree, to a CEO aspirant, the board is your business. It's not over there. You are accountable for the quality, the effectiveness of governance. You are accountable for the development of the board into a more capable governing body. I've never, I have to be honest, come across a self-developing board. And I've been doing this for many years. Not because they don't want to, but because they don't have the time to develop the board as a governing body. They can participate in board development, but they can't possibly take the lead. They have other lives. So the CEO is the sole person who can spearhead effectively board development. And I think it's important for new CEOs to come into the role knowing that this is your baby. You all agree? This is your baby. Absolutely. And how well the board does, that's your responsibility. So get cracking. And you know, I met a fellow, actually this is in the transit sector, not long ago, who did something. I'm not sure how widely it's practiced. I doubt that it's widely practiced, but I was very impressed by it. He actually got acquainted with the board before he actually occupied the CEO office. He made a real effort to appear earlier on the scene before he was officially on board to begin building key relationships. I don't honestly know, I've never done any survey how many CEO aspirants have done that once they take the helm before they arrive in the C-suite, as they say. But interesting approach and sounds pretty board savvy. Well, once again, thank you so much for taking time from what I happen to know are very hectic schedules. So you can get back to work now and have a great evening and be well and be safe. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Doug.
Thank you.